Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for the February College Connections webinar. We are thrilled with the turnout. I had a feeling this would be a very popular session. As many of you know, but for those who may be joining us for the first time, College Connections is designed to give you a unique inside perspective of the people, programs, priorities, and partnerships of the Penn State College of Agricultural Sciences. There's so much going on in the college that this has been a great way to share that information with the community, alumni, industry members, government friends, and donors, as well as others across the college and the university as a whole. Please note that we are recording this session and we'll be sharing it via email with all who registered. If you know someone who may be interested in what is covered today and missed it, we encourage you to share the recording with them. We have a dedicated web page, which you will find by searching our college's website for PSU College Connections. That's PSU College Connections. You will also find links to all past sessions and registration information for future events. Without further delay, today we are going to learn about the science of winemaking and grape growing. I am joined here by members of the college's wine and grape team, including Professor and Associate Head of Food Science, Ryan Elias, Assistant Research Professor of Fermented Beverage Science and Technology, Misha Kwasniewski, Associate Professor of Viticulture, Michaela Centenari, and last but not least, Viticulture Extension Educator, Kane Hickey. So welcome to all of you. The team is going to present as a group. So before I turn things over, I want to take a few minutes to introduce each team member. First, and then put your hands up as we go. First is Ryan Elias, who came to Penn State in 2008. His lab studies oxidants in foods and beverages as they relate to both stability and quality, especially in wine and beer oxidation. Ryan also teaches courses in plant food processing, food analysis, and advanced wine chemistry. He earned his PhD in food chemistry at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst and completed his postdoctoral training in the Department of Viticulture and Enology at the University of California, Davis. Second, Dr. Misha Kwasniewski grew up in Western New York in the Concord grape belt as part of a farming family. He earned his bachelor's in horticulture and his PhD in food science from Cornell University. Before joining us here at Penn State, Misha served as the enology program leader at the University of Missouri Grape and Wine Institute. His work spans from the field to the consumer, investigating fermented beverages through analytical chemistry, and it's included work on wine, cider, hemp, elderberries, and other products. His research looks at both important flavor considerations and basic metabolic responses. Third, we have viticulturist Dr. Michaela Centenari. Originally from Italy, she earned her PhD in horticulture from the University of Bologna and completed her postdoctoral training at Cornell. She joined Penn State in 2014 and works as part of a multidisciplinary research and extension team to address the broad needs of the grape and wine industry in the Eastern United States. Her program investigates the effects of biotic stressors and environmental factors, such as low temperatures and cultural practices, on grapevine physiology, production, and fruit and wine quality. Finally, we come to Kane Hickey, who has been a statewide extension educator since 2007. He received his master's degree and PhD from Virginia Tech and has presented at state, regional, national, and international academic and industry conferences and developed and coordinated numerous extension workshops. In addition, he has authored peer-reviewed journal articles, extension publications, fact sheets, and trade publications. His research has an applied emphasis and has been focused on pruning, training, and canopy management. Kane coordinates the Eastern Viticulture and Enology Forum webinar series and works with the Pennsylvania wine and grape industry to solve vineyard management issues and optimize grape production practices. So with that, take it away, team. I think Kane's running the projector to start with. Go for it.
All right, I am. Thank you for that introduction, Rick, and thanks for having our team here today for the College Connections webinar. Okay. Can everybody see that? Great. Okay, well, thanks for having us again. There were some questions that were pre-submitted that asked about the scope of the industry, and so I'll kick things off with just an overview of the size and scale of the Pennsylvania grape and wine industry. and then I'll turn it over to Michaela. So this 2017 data is a ranking of Pennsylvania here nationally. And if you look at the acres of bearing and non-bearing for grapes, Pennsylvania ranks 4th, although I have a feeling this data is not current, but also Washington was not included in there for some reason or another. This data was shared with me. So I have a feeling we're not 4th. We may be a little lower, but you can see roughly where we rank there on a national level. And then the right table there is number of operations or enterprises with bearing and non-bearing acreage. Okay, so this is some data from the National Agricultural Statistics Service, and this unfortunately stopped collection of annual grape production in 2018. So this busy slide, I just want to draw your attention to the lower table in 2017, which was the last year that Pennsylvania had this data collected. And you can see in the state here that in that year, 2017, we produced 13,500 tons of wine grapes. And in terms of juice and processing grapes, if you look to the right of that table, almost 80,000 tons. And you can see that the price per ton there for wine grapes is, as you might guess, higher than that of juice grapes. On the contrary, juice grapes typically produce more tons per acre, so sometimes that can be offset. Oh, we also do not know how much of the wine or juice grapes are produced in Pennsylvania, and like I said, after 2018. So we hope this service comes back. Here's a nice figure that the Pennsylvania Winery Association, the marketing group for the Pennsylvania wine industry, shows. And this is a breakdown of the winery numbers by region of the state. And as you can see, though most acreage exists up in the northwestern part of the state, where I'm from, largely due to the Concord growers, most of the wineries are either in the south central, southeastern part of the state. But as you can see, there's a fair, there's wineries all throughout the state. So wherever you're at, there's a winery nearby. So again, I think I showed this in the previous slide, about 14,000 acres of grapes, and we produce about 2 million gallons of wine annually. And right now, we hover right around 300 wineries. We don't have firm data on that, but that's right about where we're at. So 2 million gallons of wine. Sounds like a lot. Let me put that into practical terms. That means 27,000 people could drink a bottle of Pennsylvania produced wine every day for an entire year. And there would still be wine left over. And so we would ask everybody to do this and help support the Pennsylvania wine industry. And this will be my last slide before I turn it over to Michaela. Just a recent impact study that was performed, the Pennsylvania Winery Association had performed. I'll just focus on the $1.4 billion because that's generally what they call on or talk about when they talk about economic impact. So 1.4 billion. And this is, I want folks to understand that this is more than, it's not, grapes are a specialty crop. They're not a commodity where you grow it, you take it to the scales and you get paid for it. This factors in tourism, because agritourism is a big part of this industry. So folks go out and visit wineries and spend money on hotels and restaurants and so on and so forth. So this is, agritourism is a big, big factor in this industry. Okay, Michaela.
Yes, I'm next. Thank you, Kane. So also we wanted to provide a few facts about the history of the Pennsylvania wine industry, because many of us think that the PA wine industry is very young, but actually many of us don't know that the first vineyard in the United States was planted here in Pennsylvania back in 1683 by William Penn, or maybe I guess his gardener. But so the first attempt didn't go very well because people were bringing grapevine variety from Europe, and planting them here, right? So those varieties were not resistant to pests, to disease that are typical of the New World. But, you know, after a while, you know, the settlers learn, you know, what variety to grow and how to grow them. So by the 1800s, Pennsylvania had a very flourishing industry and ranked third for grape and wine production. Unfortunately, prohibition, you know, hit the industry pretty badly. And it took a while for wine production, for commercial wine production to resume. And so Kane showed, you know, that today we have more than 300 wineries, but back, you know, in 1976, so not so long ago, there were only 11 wineries. So we have seen definitely a huge increase in number of wineries across the state. And next, thank you. So, you know, we see an increased interest in planting grapes for wine production across the state. And when we talk with potential growers, and mostly Kane is, you know, our extension educator, you know, we emphasize that growing grapes is a long-term investment. And for this investment to be profitable, it's very important that the vines produce grapes for a long time, you know, 20 or more years. Because when you plant a vineyard, you know, these young vines on your left, they don't produce any grapes for 2-3 years. So there are a lot of, you know, upfront cost and a lot of decisions that needs to be made before planting a vineyard. Again, this is a long-term investment. So a lot of decision needs to be made before planting. And one is, you know, what variety to plant. We are often asked by potential growers, you know, what should I plant? And that is a very, very important decision which will affect the longevity of the vineyard. And definitely there are many factors that will affect what variety you should plant, but one definitely is the site, right? The weather conditions and the soil of the site. That is definitely the most important. That will really affect the longevity of the vineyard. But also, you know, you need to consider consumers, like what they want to drink and what they're willing to buy. So again, a lot of factors to make the hopefully, you know, best decision on what to plant in your vineyard. And next. So once, you know, the vines are planted, so, you know, then they need to be taken care of. I mean, there are a lot of management, a lot of practices that growers need to do to maintain the vines healthy and also, you know, produce high quality grapes. So maybe many of you know, pruning, which is done during the winter, and harvest, which is done at the end of the growing season, like late summer and fall. But there is a lot that is done, you know, between pruning and harvest. And, management can involve, you know, disease and pest management, but also canopy management, which the growers do all season long, right? Between bud break and harvest. And some of them are very labor intensive and are done mostly, you know, by hand, and other can be mechanized, depending if it makes economic sense. Next. So one more, so I want to mention about some challenges that we, our growers are facing. And definitely, I mean, every region, every grape growing region faces its own challenge. In Mediterranean countries, Australia, California. For us, I guess you can click, thank you. Most of the challenges, you know, relates to pests and disease. Many of you may know the Lanternfly, which is a new invasive pest, but also growers are dealing with fungal diseases and other, okay, thank you, and other diseases that can affect the quality of the grapes. There are also weather challenges, which are more out of our control. They're not so easily managed as diseases, but those also need to be taken into consideration when deciding what to plant and where to plant the varieties. Mostly, I guess, our growers are dealing with a problem with cold temperature, both during the winter, but also, you know, we have issue with spring frost. And also we have rain. I mean, many grape growing regions are facing increased drought, But for us in the Northeast, we have been seeing an increase of intense, heavy precipitation compared to other regions. And that also can create problems, not only for the soil, we have issues with soil erosion, but also, with delay ripening and disease pressure. So some of these challenges that growers in the Eastern United States are dealing with. Next.
Okay, thanks, Michaela. So this is a nice point to transition to talking about how we actually take these grapes that the growers have worked so hard to produce and convert them into wine. I think winemaking is kind of this thing that's enshrouded in mystique and romance and stuff. And as I'm going to try to explain in 5 minutes or less, it's a pretty simple process. Lots can go wrong, but it's at its heart, it's a pretty simple process. And Michaela mentioned harvest, and the harvest decision, when to harvest and how to harvest, is actually really critical in terms of the final quality of the wine. You have a few decisions in terms of how you harvest. The oldest way of harvesting grapes is by hand. If you look at the top left of the slide here, it's hard work. A lot of people think that this is a fun activity. I can assure you it's labor intensive and very hard work. Lots of benefits to harvesting by hand in terms of wine quality. You tend to preserve the integrity of the grape and preserve the quality of the grape a bit more with hand harvesting, although mechanical harvesting is certainly an option. And next slide. So once you've harvested the grapes, you've brought them back to the winery. This is now the domain of enology, of food science. This is where we come in and we start to process the fruit and start the process of making this into wine. Grapes are these little sugar sacks, lots of liquid, lots of sugar in these. And our first objective is to liberate that liquid, that sugary liquid out of the grapes. And we'll use something that looks like this on the top or on the left here. This is called a crusher destemmer. It's just a pretty simple piece of equipment that is designed to crush the fruit and remove the stems. And you can see that this is a pretty small crusher destemmer on the left. On a very large scale, industry scale, they are much bigger, obviously, but they look basically the same, very similar. At the end of this crusher destemmer, the stems fly out, and everything that drops down is the stuff that you want to collect, and that includes the juice, which is 80% of what comes out of this is about juice, is juice, and the remaining 20% are skins and seeds. And we collectively call those three things, the juice, skins, and seeds, must. You might have heard this term before. And if we remove the juice and we're left with skins and seeds, we call that pomace. So that's another term you might have heard before. Okay, so you've got some decisions now that you can make depending on what you're starting with and what you want to end up with. If you start with a white-skin grape, then it's kind of a misnomer. These are grapes that are not actually white. If you look on the left here, you'll see what I mean. They're more sort of green. If you have grapes that look like this, you're basically going to make white wine out of this. You can't make a red wine out of white grapes, okay? And it's a pretty simple process to make a white wine. You take these fruit, these clusters, and if you put them through that crusher destemmer and you liberate the juice and you press that immediately to remove the pomace, you end up with grape juice. And you can ferment that grape juice with yeast. And the yeast that we use to make wine is basically the same yeast that we use to bake bread and to make beer. And you actually don't need to start from this crushed up grape juice either. You can just take whole clusters of white grapes and put them into a press and collect your juice that way too. You can see on the right, these are very small scale fermentations. On a very large scale, we put these things in stainless steel tanks typically, but it's the same kind of process. We have some decisions we can make too. I mean, I'm oversimplifying this, of course. There's some limited number of additives that we can add at the end. We can filter, we can decide how much sweetness we want in the final wine. Lots of decisions, of course, but at its heart, this is basically the process. Okay. If you start off with a Redskin grape, you've got a few more options, actually. So if you look at the left, this picture here, these are some dark skinned grapes. And the emphasis here is on dark skin. Actually, what's inside of these grapes, these berries, is colorless. It's the pulp that's colorless. The skin is what contains all this color. If you take grapes that look like this and you crush them up and you put them into a tank and you add the yeast and you ferment everything together, and at the end of the process, you remove the solids. That's how you make a red wine, actually. If you were to take those same grapes and very carefully extract the juice by pressing very carefully, you can extract out of that material juice that doesn't have any pigment. You can actually make a white wine from these types of berries. If you do something that's a little bit in between, if you allow a little bit of contact between the skins and the juice, you can end up with like a pink wine, like a rosé. So that's how you make wine in whatever, 5 minutes or less. Usually it takes me about a month to do this in my class. It's a very old technique, very kind of simple technique, from a distance, but there's actually lots of research questions that remain and lots of interesting research topics. And I think that's what we're going to be talking about in this slide.
Sure. Well, Kane, if you wanted to just jump back one slide, I can give a little overview. So one of the things that we deal with, obviously, is supporting the PA wine and grape industry. And that's actually one of the more enjoyable parts of our job, because all of us get to interact with those that are doing some of the real fun work of this. But also, grapes are an excellent model system, as is wine really important from a cultural and historical and potentially health standpoint. And so there's a lot of research happening at Penn State that goes beyond just questions that are relevant for PA grapes and wine. And in so doing, that opens up a lot of opportunity for collaboration, in part because some of the questions that we're asking are the same questions and the same problems that people are running into all over the world. And then, as I alluded to, another aspect is that grapes and wine are just a really interesting model to use for some of this research. And with the next slide, turn it back over to Michaela.
Yes, me again. So also we wanted to provide some, example of research, or cross-disciplinary research that our team is doing. As Misha was saying, it's a fun part of our job is to work together and to work also with people outside our team within Penn State, in addition to, other institutions across the world. And so one example of this, cross-disciplinary research is definitely the research we are doing on spotted lanternfly. Probably most of you at this point, are aware of this pest, which is a nuisance for residential areas, landscaping, but also, you can go next. Unfortunately, lanternfly really loves grapes, and who doesn't? But and we didn't have any information before this pest arrived here in Pennsylvania about how to manage and what type of damage lanternfly can cause to grapevine. So growers had a lot of questions that we try to address with our research. And I think, sorry, Ken, there is an animation, so maybe you can just click. Yeah. So just to give you an example, Ken and I, we work more on the plant science unit department. So we are, our research and extension activities are on understanding what damage lanternfly cause to the grapes, and deliver this information to stakeholders. But also we work with food science people, because we need to know also how this is going to affect the wine, right? The end product, not just the grapes, but also the wine. We are also working with entomologists within the team and outside the team to help to develop IPM or management practices for lanternfly. We also work with plant pathologists, because our growers are interested or concerning that lanternfly can be a vector of pathogen, right? Viruses, bacteria, and so cause an extra damage to the vine. We are also work with ag economists to survey the industry to understand the actual economic impact of this pest on our industry. And then last, we also, work with people in the ecosystem science and management unit, because we kind of, want to compare what we have seen in vineyards with what they are seeing, happening on Lanternfly with other trees, not just Tree of Heaven, but also other, forest and landscaping crops. And I am done. Okay, this is where to thank the funding agency.
So another aspect of active research that we have going on at Penn State relates to, well, broadly, how do we make the best wines possible, right? That, as Ryan said earlier on, making wine is a pretty simple process. And as anyone who's done home winemaking can attest, you probably are going to be successful that first time. And unfortunately, then it locks you into a lifetime of trying to do it better and consistently, and maybe reproduce some of those earlier successes. And this is no different than those in the wine industry that are always trying to understand and replicate their successes, or sometimes the successes of another region. And so within wine, to create balance, we have this interplay of different elements between alcohol, obviously, but the acidity, and actually the alcohol in the wine sort of lends a bit of a sweet character. And then with red wines, especially, there's this other element that is this complex of compounds called tannins. All of these, at least, are in part coming from the fruit. So sugar and acids are mainly coming from the pulp of the fruit. And then the sugar becomes alcohol, and the tannins are coming from both the skin and the seed. Next slide. One of the challenges, though, in any cool climate is the fruit that we grow tends to just naturally be a little bit lower in tannin. And then the individual cultivars we grow also can be lower in tannin. And to really make things more complicated, we use cultivars that aren't pure European grape cultivars. So they've got new genetics in them that we don't even completely understand what's going on. And so we have a number of projects that are going everything from what's happening in the field and growing conditions and hands-on, aspects of how much light is the fruit exposed to, and how does that ultimately, in fact, affect tannin accumulation, to things where we're trying to manipulate the process to pull a little bit more or retain a little bit more of these compounds that are both have bioactive importance, but are really related to quality. That if you want a big, full wine, a big, full red wine, you need that tannin backbone. And without it, you really have something that's more red in color, but has the mouthfeel of a white wine. And so we're making some headway on this, but this has been a question that winemakers and growers have been challenged with for centuries. So still more yet to be done.
Okay, thank you, Michaela, Ryan, and Misha. I'll talk about extension briefly before I turn it back over to Ryan, and then we get to the fun part, which is the interaction and engagement with Rick. So I'm an extension educator. What that means is that I communicate practical knowledge with the growers, not just in Pennsylvania, but regionally. And due to our increase of web-based activity, we have reached people from over 30 states and international audiences through, in large part, this Eastern Viticulture and Enology Forum, where I've coordinated this with colleagues from Virginia Tech and Cornell. A lot of these webinars have received registrations in the amount of 200 to 500 registrants every time. And again, we're happy about that. And so it allows us to increase our reach and contact of our programs here at Penn State. And then another way we work with industry is we've collaborated on this Pennsylvania Grape and Wine Industry Conference that we're having here in State College in early March. And we've invited colleagues from Cornell and industry stakeholders from Virginia and Maryland, as well as Michaela and Misha and myself will be giving talks at this, as well as Pennsylvania stakeholders. So these are just some of the ways that we collaborate and communicate with our stakeholders here in Pennsylvania, but also beyond state borders. Earlier, I talked about some data that we don't really have a good grasp on. And one thing that we're doing to provide information to Pennsylvania growers is this Cultivars in the Commonwealth web application, where when it's launched, folks can go and choose the county that they're interested in, and what will happen is the list of cultivars that are grown in that county will populate, and then they can figure out the details of how those cultivars rank in those counties based on stakeholder feedback. So we sent out a survey to generate this data, and then we're putting it out to the industry again in hopes that it will help people be more judicious planters, or choosing cultivars more judiciously based on any trait of interest. We asked about growth details, cold injury and frost, maturity, sales, consumer demand. And so this is basically empowering growers, both new and veteran, to choose what they want to plant based on their traits of interest. And so we're really excited to launch this. This should be live in April. And again, it not just tells the acreage and the amount, but why people like these cultivars, or what they do like and what they don't like about them. So we're excited about that.
All right, in the remaining few minutes we have here, I just wanted to talk a little bit about our students and how our students enrolled in courses at Penn State are learning about wine and contributing to the wine industry. So if you look on the left, you'll actually see a group of students here. These are students, seniors in food science in my class, making wine. And the class that they take with me is a required course, which means every single food science major coming out of Penn State knows about wine, knows how wine is made, has actually made wine themselves, real hands-on knowledge of the process. So I've been teaching this class since 2008, and a little less than 1,000 undergrads have gone through our program since that time and have learned to make wine. You'll see some nice equipment that we've got that we didn't have when I got here. We've been really building our infrastructure in our pilot plant. You can see a pretty nice crusher destemmer here, but in the back, might be hard to see, a brand new fermentation chamber, that 2-room chamber that we use to ferment wines in, and lots of other really nice equipment that we have to make high quality wines. Our grad students too are also interested in making wine, and thanks to generous support from our industry, we've been able to fund dozens of masters and PhD students in food science and in plant science over the years. And a lot of the students have gone on to accept jobs in the industry. You can see in the center here, this is a lot of our students have earned scholarships in recent years, have been recognized. And yeah, we've made lots of, we're proud of our accomplishments over the last 10 years in this area. Next slide, Kane. What we see in the future, the next few years, maybe the next decade or so, is hopefully continued growth in this area. Possibly some new undergraduate minors or options focusing specifically on enology or viticulture, maybe some graduate programs we're exploring, always looking to build and sustain collaborations with industry partners, university partners throughout the world. Recently, we've started to build infrastructure to support basic and advanced analysis of wine samples in our department to help the industry. And hopefully someday, maybe soon, who knows, we'll have a dedicated research, teaching, and extension winery on campus at University Park. Right now, all of this work is done in our pilot plant in the Department of Food Science, which is a great facility. But it's a multi-use facility. A lot of other food products are made there. Our goal is to have a dedicated winery on campus at some point. So if you'd like to write a check. And I think that is all we have at this point. And I think this is the point where we're going to talk to Rick and answer some of your questions. So thank you.
Sorry about that. Jumped the gun. Thanks for the great opening presentation. So we've got time for Q&A. So please try to send your questions to the Q&A section. It'll be easier for us to keep track of it. But there have been a few things in chat that my colleagues and I will try to handle as well. So one of the big issues, and Michaela highlighted this, foreshadowed this, is that climate change is going to affect a lot of Pennsylvania agriculture. And in particular, as Michaela said, we're expecting heavier rain events and so forth, which will have impacts on grapes. So I was going to ask Kane about this. What's the greatest impact of climate change expected to be for the Pennsylvania wine industry?
Yeah, so far what we're seeing, Rick, is winters with a little bit more moderate temperatures. And then as we're coming out of the winter into the spring, we get undulations. And that's not good because that can result in vine deacclimation prematurely, and cold injury can happen as a function of that. So we like things to get cold, stay cold, and then come out and gradually warm up. And we're seeing more fluctuations in temperature, which can pose increased risk for cold injury. What we're also seeing is grapes are breaking bud earlier. So that sounds great because you think it's a longer growing season. When in fact, what happens is they break bud, and then they're more prone to spring frost injury. That can decrease crop precipitously if a spring frost event happens. And then, as Michaela mentioned, we see a rainfall and drought periods in greater magnitude. Like if it rained before, we would see some rain or some drought. Now we're seeing very exacerbated periods of that, which doesn't really bode well for the perennial health of the crop or the current season of the crop. So a lot of rain can make it difficult to ripen. So we can combat those in many ways, but choosing cultivars wisely. For example, if a grapevine has good secondary bud fruitfulness, all of a sudden, if you get a spring frost, your secondary bud could produce 60 or 70% of the crop that primary bud did. So that would be a fiscally judicious choice, right? To choose a grape like that. So those are just some of the things that we're thinking about with climate change.
So one of the follow-up parts of this question was our efforts to facilitate newly available varieties in the state, or should we put more energy into adaptation of current crop systems? And probably there's enough variation in grape varieties. You're probably looking at new grape varieties, a much quicker way of getting there. That be about right? Yeah. So there was a question in the Q&A already. How has climate change affected pruning? And that's related to a question we had submitted earlier. What's the best time to prune back grapes and how to avoid black rot? So how is climate change affecting that? And is black rot, how do we avoid things like black rot while at it?
You want me to take that, Michaela? Okay. So pruning, the best time to prune is during the dormant period, which is any time between leaf fall, which usually happens in early December or late November, and bud break, which depending on where you're at can happen in mid-April or earlier. There are some advanced pruning strategies that can delay bud break and therefore potentially decrease your risk of spring frost. And Michaela and I have both researched some of that. The other thing is choosing when to prune, the order you prune cultivars, because some of these cultivars that are not as cold hardy, you want to maybe delay those so that if a cold event happens, you can cut buds and assess what you need to do. Maybe you need to save more buds to ensure a full crop. So we would recommend usually pruning the more cold hardy cultivars first, And then if a cold event happens later in the winter, you have time to react by saving more buds in case a cold injury event happens to those less hardy cultivars.
Thanks. So keeping on the theme of climate change, one of the other questions we got was, how has the science of developing differing strains of yeast in terms of percentage alcohol been evolving over the past few decades, and what strains are available and so forth? So I was going to hand this one off to Misha, because I know that internationally, one of the impacts of climate change has been raised the amount of sugar in grapes. It makes it really tough to keep the alcohol down to an acceptable level. So what are we doing about alcohol management, Misha?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Yeast research is definitely an active area of development that new yeast strains are coming out and being bred to be able to go up to higher and higher alcohol levels, where also new selections are starting to be made that are non-Saccharomyces. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae is the classic wine brewing bread yeast that's used across all of those. But there's lots and lots of diversity in yeast out there. And one of the big new things on the horizon is new selections being brought into winemaking, that some of which are allowing you to degrade more of the acid. Some of them are able to divert some of the pathways away from alcohol so that you're producing more of something like glycerol rather than having these giant 16, 17% alcohol wines. And I think just one other really cool development is anyone who's ever had a wine that smells like rotten eggs, that's this compound hydrogen sulfide. And there's been yeast selections that are now on the market that do not produce this compound. So it sort of becomes a problem of the past if you use these yeast strains.
So there must be some advanced chemical diagnostics for all doing all this, Misha. How do people go about measuring these kinds of things?
Oh, we've got some great tools in the department for looking at various things. Everything from using some tried and true technology that have been used in the wine industry, for centuries, things like just using boiling point to be able to measure alcohol and some simple distillations, everything up to we have liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry and the ability to get down to sometimes part per trillion level. In Ryan's lab, he's really pushed ahead with being able to do some really cool things with volatile thiols. And so these are compounds that are also at exceedingly low levels and have the other annoyance when it comes to measuring them of oxidizing very easily. And so these compounds that give you the cat pee aroma and things that are really important to some varietals, we're now able to measure in-house.
Great. So it just gives you an idea of the for the audience, the kinds of things that are now available in terms of measuring all these compounds. I want to shift gears because Michaela also foreshadowed spotted lanternfly, which, as she said, when it first arrived in Pennsylvania, it was known from the Korean literature that it could affect grapes. We really didn't have any kind of idea of what it would do here, and yet it immediately started pillaging one vineyard near the initial site where it had been found and killed that vineyard. So we know it's a pretty serious pest. We've been doing a lot of work on this in various ways to try to keep it at bay. So what about it? What do you what are some of the pesticides used in grapes, and how do you manage spotted lanternfly and fungal diseases together in these vineyards, Michaela?
Mm-hmm. So in terms of managing, so there are, depends. I mean, if you don't have lanternfly yet in your vineyard, definitely you want to scout first, scout the edges and the area around. But if you have lanternfly in your vineyard, unfortunately, you need to, you need to spray insecticide, and the type of pesticide that you can use depends on, when you harvest the grapes, So some have, let's going back. The problem with lanternfly is that the adults are in the vineyard very close to harvest, right? So there are problems like there are not many pesticides that can be used very close to harvest because we don't want to harm, the plant, but also we don't want residual pesticide in the grapes and in the wine. So there are a number of pesticides that can be used, but when you're close to harvest, this number is, is shorter. But you can find a list of insecticide that can be used depending on also the lanternfly stage, going for, egg masses, nymphs, adult, on a Penn State extension publication that is on the website. And if we can put in the chat the link, and there you can find the comprehensive list of pesticides.
So just posted in the chat. People can just simply Google Penn State Spotted Lanternfly Management and be able to find it.
Yeah, and there is one, publication just for vineyards, right? How to manage lanternfly in vineyards. Because from what we have seen from our research, when the lanternfly is not managed, and you have a lot of lanternfly, definitely can affect the ability of the vine to produce sugars and to store these important nutrients and sugar that are important for vine health and quality and grape quality. So it's important to manage the lanternfly. But now growers are learning more and more how to manage, and they can. We feel like they can keep the population under control compared to 3 years ago when we didn't know anything. And so we consider the lanternfly, I guess, an additional stressor, an additional that the vines needs to deal with, in addition to disease or weather is something else the vineyard and the grower needs to deal with. Yeah. And I think you had a question about disease. You mentioned about disease and the lanternfly. Some growers noted that, when lanternfly were feeding on their vine, they noted like crown gall, which is basically another disease. So they noted like the plant seems to respond by showing other disease symptoms when lanternfly was feeding. So we don't know yet, if the presence of the lanternfly can transmit any viruses or any pathogen, and we don't know if vines that are healthy or already have, disease, they're more and less susceptible or tolerant to lanternfly feeding. So we're looking actually also into that because, of course, the vines have many other disease and viruses, not just the lanternfly. So we need to better understand this interaction to help with management practices.
Yeah, I like to, spotted lanternfly is something I've been personally interested in, and we've been trying to, develop a vision about how to manage this. And I think what we've come to is we're trying to develop strategies to control spotted lanternfly population increases in the woodland areas near vineyards. So we really reduce the number of adults that can move into vineyards. So we're doing a lot of work on that. And I think we've been for a whole bunch of things we're doing in detection techniques and so forth. Penn State's been recognized as the organization doing the most research on spotted lanternfly at this point. The other thing we're trying to do is encourage people, particularly, it hasn't arrived in Erie yet, but we've got a lot of evidence that although tree of heaven is a preferred host, it's not the only thing that spotted lanternflies can eat, but it appears that areas that have low densities of tree of heaven can have fewer problems, including Adams County right now. And so I'm also going to put in the chat how you can control tree of heaven, because we think that's a good system to reduce the capacity of population growth for spotted lanternflies. So collectively, we think it's a pretty big problem, but we've been doing a lot of work to get on top of it. So maybe moving along to the questions other questions have been submitted before we started. One of the questions, Misha, was what are the requirements in order to become a commercial winemaker? What are the biggest hurdles for entry into the Pennsylvania wine industry, and what are the upfront costs?
So there's this age-old joke, I think, as long as there's been wineries, that the great way to make a small fortune is to start out with a large one. I'm not quite so pessimistic. I think you can certainly gain entry into the wine industry without a fortune, but it is costly and it is time consuming. One thing that we have going for us in Pennsylvania is that there is a segment that is for farm wineries. And so that helps sort of lower the cost of entry. However, first off, you need to plan that you will be going through a lot of filing and a lot of legal hurdles to get your federal and state licensing, and probably also dealing with some local issues. And that optimistically, even if we are working with a lawyer, may take a year or two to get through. And that's before you can even start to make bottle one of wine. To the point about cost, I would say probably the absolute minimum you should be thinking probably around 100,000. This is by virtue of the fact that, you know, just legally it's going to be about 10,000. Every piece of that equipment that Ryan outlined probably is, you know, $5,000 to $10,000 a piece of it. Bottles are expensive. A cork, one cork costs $1, $1.50 a piece. But that said, there are some micro wineries in the state that have been able to get excellent products to the consumer, even with things that are just sort of coming out of the garage. So as long as you plan ahead and are, I would say, pessimistic about your timeline, plan for the worst and hope for the best. It definitely is an industry that, you know, many people from all sorts of different scales and sizes can get into.
All right, thanks a lot, Misha. So Michaela and Kane, there's a couple of other questions that were submitted about good location in Pennsylvania to grow wine grapes. Which grape is best for Central PA? So as was shown on the map earlier, there's grapes being grown all over the state, but what are the characteristics of areas that are particularly good for producing wine grapes? Michaela, you want to take a crack at that one?
You want me to?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's the same, yeah.
Okay. Well, as Michaela mentioned before, site selection is paramount. Grapes can be grown across the state, and they are grown across the state. So the idea that something is, magical about the southeastern part of the state or up along the lake, I mean, sure, there's factors, but what it comes down to is the site itself, what we would consider the mesoclimate. So the macroclimate might be the region, the mesoclimate might be your vineyard. And so we like land that's convex in shape to shed water and shed cold air and be exposed to prevailing winds and air movement to help with disease management. So the idea that, I'll just say this, in the same county or the same township could have vastly differing growing properties based on the specific site.
Okay, I think that's probably helpful for a lot of people. Ryan, one of the questions we had was about an expired wine kit. If they're past their expiry date, are they still safe to use?
It should still be safe from a food safety perspective. It's you're not going to die from any kind of pathogen from it. I think these things, I haven't worked with these much, but they do have expiration dates, and that's mostly just for quality. And I think the expiration dates on these things are probably in the range of months to years, you know, and after, if you let the thing sit at room temperature for maybe 5 years, maybe your wine won't taste as great, but yeah, you're not going to get, you know, foodborne illness from it. Yeah.
Thanks, Ryan. So we'll move into the Q&A, and some of these questions we've picked up already. So Marianne, I think we answered your question about pruning. Connie and Terry, are any of the wine cultivars grown on a specific rootstock? And if so, which ones are the best? Any suggestions about that, Kane or Michaela?
I mean, I can comment that all the grapes that we grow, wine grapes, are grafted. I mean, you need a rootstock, right? Otherwise, there is phylloxera. I mean, the vine is going to decline. What rootstock? I mean, there are many rootstocks, but also depends. There is not like the best one, right? And also depends what the nursery, has, right? Because there are so many rootstocks available, but when you contact the nursery, usually they have the grapevines, the variety that you want to buy, let's say Cab Franc, maybe grafted on 2-3 different rootstocks, right, which are the most popular. So I would say there are 2-3 rootstocks that are the most popular that we use here in the East Coast, at least, you know, and I mean, I can tell you the name, but those are the most common. I don't think there is like the best rootstocks, and I think mostly depend on the soil, right? What nutrients, water your soil has, and the root system, you know, will grow differently depending on the soil environment. So you can have the same rootstock performing differently into different sites. Going back to the site, the importance of selecting the best site possible for that variety. So I hope I answered the question.
That sounds good. One of the things Michaela referred to is phylloxera. So phylloxera are aphid-like insects to get to the roots of the vines. A little known fact, it was an American entomologist, Charles Valentine Riley, who after phylloxera got into France and was threatening to wipe out the French wine industry, proposed they ought to do grafts onto American rootstocks that were resistant to phylloxera, and that saved wine in France. Little known fact. Are PA grape harvests consistent in sugar and acid levels, Jeff? Jeff wrote. Very all over the map, Michaela?
Yeah, I'll just say that because we grow grapes in a humid climate, depending on what humid continental for the most part in Pennsylvania, we can get dry vintages and then we can have really wet vintages. So it's not like an arid or Mediterranean climate where their vintages, especially their ripening periods, are pretty predictable, which results in predictable fruit chemistry. If we get a lot of rain, that could result in low sugars and high acids. But if we're really dry, it can result in high sugars and low acids. So I would say relatively variable compared to other climates.
It's also, what makes interesting, right? Drinking wine. I mean, I like, every vintage is different, right? So you don't want the same product, right?
Okay, good answers there. So one of the questions Pedro has asked is any research regarding Pennsylvania wine export sales and markets. If we have anything like that, could somebody put a link into the chat, into the Q&A to answer that question? Research regarding, we must have something in the extension system, but maybe somebody can find a link to pop in there. Michaela, maybe, do you foresee collaboration with Italy, Sicily in the not too distant future?
Well, I would love to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, definitely their climate, and their challenges are very different than us, right? They don't have any water, it's too hot, but definitely, will be also good, for example, for our students to spend, a period in a different climate, right? I mean, studying or working with grapes in a different climate and environment, like to learn both, Mediterranean and cool climate. It's always interesting. So I hope so.
So one of the next questions is about, are varietals that are better adapted to colder climates than Pennsylvania a better choice than those, say, for Washington, California? I think we say yes to that, right? You want to go look for cold climates to do that. Another question is, what's the best strategy to fight black rot? This is
so black rot is considered the Achilles heel of organic grape farming. So we have lots of chemistries, and I won't go into which ones. Brian Head, we have a grape pathologist that strictly focuses on disease on grapes. Black rot is very easily controlled with modern chemistries, pesticides, but if you don't spray it, black rot can take down a vineyard pretty readily. So there's lots of chemistries that can control it.
Right. Another question is orientation of vines, north, south, east, west.
Do it for safety. Figure out your land that you want, and we don't want tractors flipping over. There's pros and cons to all these. Depending on the training system too. The training system can catch sunlight in various ways, depending on which way they're oriented. So if it's a VSP and it's a hedgerow, if they're north-south, it'll catch sun on the east and the west side, but cast a very small shadow when that sun's around solar noon. Whereas if you have a more umbrella-like canopy, that is catching sun throughout the day. So I always tell people, be practical about it. If you have a highly sloped site, greater than 10, 15%, maybe running the rows up and down for tractor safety, because if you're running them across, that tractor is always going to be leaning, right? And we have no trouble getting dewy ground and grass that's slippery. So yeah, that's what I'll say about row orientation.
Okay, well, unfortunately, I think it's been great. I'm really enjoying all this, but and I wish we had more time, but we've run out of time. We'll try to save the questions and so forth and try to get information back out to you elsewhere to answer those questions. But I need to wrap up. I want to say extend a special thank you to Ryan, Misha, Michaela, and Kane for preparing for this and delivering all this information today. And to our audience, before you log off, please make note of the next sessions that will be listed on your screen for March and April. In March, I'll be joined by Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education, Tracy Hoover, for a session on recruiting and training the next generation of ag professionals. Then in April, I'll be joined by Professor of Agricultural and Biological Engineering, and also the Director of the Penn State Institutes of Energy and Environment, Tom Richard, and Assistant Professor of Forest Resource Management, Melissa Cry, for a session called Follow the Carbon, Re-envisioning the Carbon Economy. So we hope to see you then. Thank you for joining us today and have a great afternoon.